Every cultivar carries a birthplace, but some are remembered less for the soil they came out of and more for the story that carried them forward. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential emerged from two very different worlds, yet both became anchors in the myth of cannabis as a plant split between opposites. One was a whispered clone on the East Coast, spread through handshakes, growers' trust, and the reputation of a man whose name itself became a myth. The other was polished by a new wave of seed companies, displayed on international stages, and exported back into American culture as proof of the Indica archetype. Together, they reflect the split between underground folklore and polished branding, a divide that shaped cannabis literacy at the turn of the millennium. Strawberry Cough's roots begin not with Amsterdam trophies or glossy seed catalogs, but with a grower named Kyle Cushman and a cutting passed from hand to hand in the 1990s. Its parentage was never written down in lab notes or confirmed by genetic testing. Some say it descended from a cultivar called Strawberry Fields crossed with a haze. Others argue the strawberry scent was more accident than design, a quirk of phenotype carried forward by a careful eye. What mattered was not the paperwork, but the experience. The aroma of ripe strawberries was so unusual, so memorable, that the plant needed no further marketing. The story said you could cough on its sweet smoke and taste fruit at the back of your throat. The name, the flavor, and the sensory quirk were enough to make it legendary. On the East Coast, where cannabis lacked coffee shop menus or glossy magazines, stories spread through trust, and clones like Strawberry Cough became cultural passwords. If you had the cut, you had credibility. If you smoked it, you had proof that cannabis could be playful, fragrant, even joyful in a way that contrasted sharply with the heavy Afghanicas dominating basements and barns. LA Confidential was born in a different arena. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Amsterdam had already proven itself as a hub for breeders, and seed companies like DNA Genetics began to merge European stability with American branding. LA Confidential was one of their flagships, built from Afghani genetics and a California-bred line called Ella Affy. Where Strawberry Cough thrived as rumor and clone, Louisiana Confidential thrived as catalog entry and competition winner. It was marketed as a pure indica at a time when the word itself was shorthand for strength, sedation, and depth. DNA Genetics polished it for judges and consumers alike, ensuring that it was not just a plant, but a brand. In Amsterdam, it won High Times Cannabis Cups, and in California, its name carried weight as part of a broader cultural export. It appeared in music, in movies, in magazines, even earning cameo mentions that tied it to Hollywood cool. The name itself was cinematic, borrowed from a neo-noir film, and that aesthetic mattered. It was not just cannabis. It was identity, an LA lifestyle compressed into a jar. Placed side by side, Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential represent two opposite ends of cannabis storytelling. One was fragile, clone only, circulating quietly through growers who believed in its uniqueness. The other was fortified, stabilized, and marketed, backed by the machinery of breeders who understood how to make a plant a household name. Strawberry Cough was East Coast underground, personal and sensory. LA Confidential was West Coast spectacle, polished and global. Strawberry Cough taught consumers to believe in aroma and experience, to trust their senses. LA Confidential taught consumers to believe in branding and category, to trust the label Indica as shorthand for everything they thought they knew. Both became cultural anchors not just for what they were, but for what they represented in a moment when cannabis was struggling to define itself between myth and science, secrecy and visibility, folklore and marketing. Lineage in cannabis is never just genetics. It is memory, rumor, branding, and trust, and it is as much about who tells the story as what plants were crossed. With Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential, Lineage takes on two different roles, one uncertain, almost folkloric, the other precise, documented, and presented as proof. Together, they reveal how cannabis identity was split not just by chemistry, but by the way heritage was narrated. Strawberry cough's parentage has always been an open question, and that uncertainty is part of what gave it power. The common story is that it came from a cultivar called Strawberry Fields, crossed with a haze, though what haze and what cut remains unclear. Strawberry Fields itself was said to be an Indica-dominant strain grown in Vermont, known for its berry aroma and relaxed qualities. Crossed with a haze, the story goes, it gained the brightness and uplift that set Strawberry Cough apart. But the truth is less tidy. There are no breeder logs, no dated notebooks, no genetic tests to verify this cross. Kyle Cushman, the grower most associated with Strawberry Cough, described it as almost an accident, a plant discovered rather than engineered. That lack of documentation could have been a weakness, but in the Prohibition-era East Coast, it was a strength. Mystery protected growers, and mystery made stories travel. To say you had Strawberry Cough was to hold something others could not verify, but desperately wanted to believe. Its lineage was less about parent plants and more about sensory identity, the unmistakable strawberry nose that carried through cuts and grows regardless of the missing paperwork. The clone-only status of Strawberry Cough deepened this effect. Unlike strains that could be bought as seeds from a catalog, Strawberry Cough was never easily replicated. It was passed directly from grower to grower, a physical lineage carried in living tissue. Each handoff was a bond of trust, a signal that you were inside the circle. Lineage here was not just genetic but social, a network of connections that could be traced not in scientific terms but in personal relationships. That is why the uncertainty of its ancestry never diminished its importance. Instead, it elevated it, because what mattered was not knowing exactly where it came from, but being part of the few who had access. Strawberry Cough's lineage is the story of how cannabis identity can be built from absence, how lack of clarity itself becomes a form of credibility in a culture built on secrecy. LA Confidential tells a different story, one shaped not by absence, but by deliberate design. Its lineage is generally agreed upon, a cross between an Afghani line and an LA Affy cut. The Afghani side carried the density, resin production, and short flowering associated with broad-leafed plants from Central Asia. These were the traits that had already defined what the market thought of as indica. The LA Affy side, a California-bred cultivar with its own underground history, added flavor, resin quality, and a link to West Coast identity. Together, they created a plant that embodied the indica archetype with enough personality to stand apart. Unlike Strawberry Cough, which thrived in uncertainty, Louisiana Confidential thrived in clarity. DNA Genetics promoted it with pride, printing its parentage in catalogs, entering it into competitions, and repeating its pedigree in press releases and strain descriptions. The message was clear. This was not a mystery plant. This was a defined, intentional creation. But clarity does not mean simplicity. LA Confidential's Afghani backbone carried with it decades of breeding history, stretching back to the valleys of the Hindu Kush, where plants were selected for resin and resilience. LA Affy, though less widely documented, symbolized the hybrid vigor and experimentation of the California underground, where growers blended imported lines with local ingenuity. When DNA Genetics put these two together, they were not just crossing plants. They were merging geographies. Afghanistan's mountains with California's streets, Amsterdam's seed banks with Los Angeles's cultural cachet. The result was more than a plant. It was a statement that cannabis could be codified, branded, and exported with its lineage intact. Placed side by side, the contrast could not be sharper. Strawberry Cough's lineage is a fog, a story that depends on absence, aroma, and personal trust. LA Confidential's lineage is a spotlight, a story polished into clarity, published, and sold as proof of indica identity. One taught consumers that mystery could be authenticity, that not knowing was part of the experience. The other taught consumers that documentation could be authority, that knowing was what gave a plant its cultural weight. Both are true to cannabis history because cannabis has always lived in the tension between secrecy and spectacle. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential are not just plants with parents. They are reflections of how lineage itself becomes narrative, one whispered, one printed, each carrying the authority that their cultural moment demanded. Cannabis culture is not built in laboratories or grow rooms alone. It is built in the stories consumers tell each other, in the reputations that travel further than the plants themselves, and in the expectations that turn chemistry into experience. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential became cultural anchors not simply because of their genetics, but because of how they were positioned in the public imagination. Each strain carried more than cannabinoids. They carried symbols of how cannabis was understood, bought, and lived. Strawberry Cough's cultural power lay in its uniqueness. In a time when cannabis on the East Coast was often anonymous, bricks pressed from Mexico, bags of nameless dro, jars labeled only by dealer creativity, Strawberry Cough stood out as something with identity. Its strawberry aroma was undeniable, almost theatrical in its departure from the earth and musk that dominated most underground markets. For consumers, it was proof that cannabis could be playful, fruit-forward, and refined. For growers, it was a reminder that clone-only cuts could travel like rumors, spreading reputation more effectively than any magazine feature. Strawberry Cough became the kind of name that needed no description, saying it was enough to conjure both the taste and the story. That gave it weight as a cultural marker. It symbolized the possibility that cannabis could be both underground and elegant, both secretive and expressive. But its impact went deeper than flavor. Strawberry Cough became a shorthand for the Sativa archetype on the East Coast, not because it was genetically pure, but because its bright aroma and reported cerebral energy matched the cultural script. Smokers primed to believe in daytime weed, or creative sativa, found in Strawberry Cough, a perfect ambassador. The name itself implied levity, a sweetness that softened the stigma around cannabis for casual users. In cultural terms, Strawberry Cough was more than a strain. It was an argument that cannabis could be approachable, sensory, and social, not just heavy and illicit. Its popularity showed how much weight consumers gave to story and smell, often more than to lineage or chemistry. LA Confidential, by contrast, became a cultural icon of weight and seriousness. Where Strawberry Cough lifted, Louisiana Confidential grounded. Its branding leaned into depth, heaviness, and the archetype of the Indica couch lock. DNA genetics didn't just release a strain, they released an identity. The name, pulled from a Hollywood crime thriller, fused cannabis with cinematic cool, making the plant feel like part of a lifestyle rather than a vice. For smokers, Louisiana Confidential became the strain you reached for when you wanted strength, when you wanted the classic, when you wanted to prove you knew what real indica meant. Its reputation was so firm that it became a teaching tool. Budtenders and reviewers alike pointed to it as the textbook example of sedating cannabis. In this way, it reinforced the binary myth at the exact moment it was solidifying into global cannabis literacy. The cultural power of LA Confidential also came from its visibility. It won awards, and those awards mattered. Every Cannabis Cup trophy was an advertisement not just to Amsterdam tourists, but to consumers around the world who read about it in High Times or saw it listed in seed catalogs. Awards gave it legitimacy, and legitimacy hardened into identity. While Strawberry Cough circulated by clone, building a mystique of exclusivity, Louisiana Confidential circulated by name, building a reputation of accessibility. Anyone could buy seeds, anyone could read its description, and anyone could confirm its category. That universality turned it into a cultural anchor. For better or worse, it helped cement the idea that indica was not just a word, but a reliable promise. Together, Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential show how cannabis culture was split between two forces, mystery and marketing. Strawberry Cough thrived because it was elusive, clone-only, and built on sensory surprise. It taught consumers to trust their noses, to believe that uniqueness could outweigh uncertainty. LA Confidential thrived because it was visible, polished, and backed by awards. It taught consumers to trust branding, to believe that categories could be confirmed by trophies and catalogs. Each strain became shorthand for a side of cannabis literacy: Strawberry Cough for playful uplift, Louisiana Confidential for heavy sedation. And each became proof, to those who wanted it, that the Sativa Indica myth was real. That cultural weight still lingers today, long after the chemistry has shown us otherwise. When you strip away the stories, what remains is chemistry. But chemistry never speaks in the neat categories consumers are sold. It does not say, this is a sativa, or this is an indica. It speaks in balances, in ratios, in how terpenes and cannabinoids layer themselves into expression. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential are perfect case studies because their cultural reputations were so strong. Yet their chemical realities were far more complicated. Strawberry Cough first. What most people remember is the aroma: sweet, almost candied strawberry, with a faint herbal sharpness behind it. That aroma is driven by an unusual terpene profile, where terpenoline often plays a starring role. Terpenoline is rare in cannabis, but when it dominates, it produces aromas that feel bright, fruity, and sometimes floral. In the cultural imagination, that brightness became synonymous with sativa. Consumers who had already been told to expect energy and creativity from sativas inhaled terpenoline and confirmed the story. But terpenoline is not a guarantee of energy. Its actual pharmacological role in cannabis is subtle, more about aroma and perception than about direct physiological impact. The daytime effect consumers swore by was as much psychological priming as it was chemical reality. Strawberry Cough's terpenoline became proof of sativa not because the plant demanded it, but because consumers read the aroma through a script already written. Alongside terpenoline, pinene often surfaces in Strawberry Cough, adding a sharp, resinous note reminiscent of pine needles. Pinene is culturally linked to clarity, the sense of a clear-headed high that resists fogginess. In Strawberry Cough, pinene reinforced what people wanted to believe, that this was clean, social, cerebral cannabis. Again, the chemistry aligned just enough with the myth to give it staying power. Consumers could point to the nose, point to their experiences, and convince themselves that here was a perfect example of sativa. But Strawberry Cough was not chemically stable across all cuts. Some expressions leaned more heavily on caryophyllene, the peppery terpene that adds grounding spice. Some carried moderate amounts of myrcene, which in higher concentrations is usually linked with relaxation and heaviness. When that happened, smokers expecting only lightness found themselves slowed down, puzzled that their daytime strain carried unexpected weight. The truth is, Strawberry Cough was never chemically pure. It was variable, layered, sometimes bright, sometimes heavier than promised. Yet the myth smoothed over those contradictions, allowing consumers to carry the name forward as shorthand for light, fruity sativa. Now, Louisiana Confidential, the supposed opposite. If Strawberry Cough was known for sweetness and brightness, Louisiana Confidential was known for density and depth. Its terpene profile often leaned heavily on myrcene, the most common terpene in cannabis, with its earthy, musky, herbal undertones. Myrcene became synonymous in consumer lore with couch lock, the body-heavy sedation that the word indica came to promise. In LA Confidential, high myrcene expression reinforced the myth perfectly. Smokers reported heaviness, stillness, and a sense that the plant anchored them in place. This aligned so neatly with the indica archetype that LA Confidential was held up as a textbook case, proof that the category was real. But just like Strawberry Cough, Louisiana Confidential's chemistry was not static. Not every cut or grow produced the same ratios. In certain expressions, caryophyllene appeared in abundance, adding spicy, peppered tones to the aroma and contributing to the sense of weight and presence. Caryophyllene is unique because it interacts with cannabinoid receptors as well as olfactory ones, though consumers did not know this when they smoked it. What they knew was that LA Confidential felt strong, authoritative, almost authoritative in its heaviness. Caryophyllene gave it body, grounding the plant in a way that matched the branding. But LA Confidential also carried limonene in some cuts, a terpene with bright citrus tones more often associated with uplift and laughter. When limonene was prominent, some smokers found themselves surprised, even confused. Instead of being knocked flat, they found moments of brightness, even euphoria. In prohibition or early dispensary contexts, these contradictions were often ignored. Bud tenders still sold LA Confidential as a knockout indica, and consumers still repeated the legend. But in truth, its chemistry was more layered, more variable, sometimes betraying the very myth that made it famous. On the cannabinoid side, both Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential were THC dominant with little CBD, a profile that reinforced their reputations for being strong. Strawberry Cough often tested in the mid to high teens during its early years, later climbing into the 20s as breeding and cultivation practices intensified. LA Confidential often matched or exceeded those numbers, with dense resin production that gave it the visual appearance of strength even before anyone smoked it. Both plants carried trace minor cannabinoids, CBC, CBG, occasional THCV, but these were rarely discussed outside of scientific or enthusiast circles. To most consumers, THC percentage was all that mattered, and both cultivars delivered enough to satisfy the expectation of potency. Placed side by side, the chemistry of Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential shows us what culture does to plants. Strawberry Cough's terpenoline and pinene brightness were lifted up as proof of sativa. Even though caryophyllene and myrcene often complicated the picture, LA Confidential's myrcene and caryophyllene density were lifted up as proof of indica, even though limonene sometimes betrayed the stereotype. In both cases, consumers and bud tenders flattened the variability into a story. Chemistry never promised consistency, but culture demanded it, and so the myth survived. Literacy in cannabis is the art of reading beyond the label. It is the difference between memorizing a name and understanding what that name actually represents. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential are ideal examples because both became so cemented in consumer imagination that their names themselves acted as guarantees. One promised a sweet, bright, uplifting ride. The other promised heaviness, sedation, the classic indica experience. But literacy asks us to look closer and see where those guarantees fall apart, not to dismiss their stories, but to understand the plant beneath them. For Strawberry Cough, literacy begins with aroma. That strawberry scent, so rare and distinctive, became shorthand for sativa. Consumers and bud tenders alike would smell it and immediately frame the experience in terms of lightness, social energy, and daytime suitability. A literate approach doesn't reject that association, but it places it in context. Terpenoline and pinene can lean bright, yes, but they don't promise a consistent outcome. A literate bud tender knows that Strawberry Cough can vary, that some cuts carry more caryophyllene or myrcene, that the plant's actual effect depends on balance rather than name. They can explain to a consumer that the strawberry nose signals certain terpene patterns, but does not guarantee one outcome. They can encourage the consumer to pay attention to how their own body and context shape the experience, rather than relying on the word sativa as if it were science. Literacy means teaching the consumer to see Strawberry Cough not as proof of a category, but as an expression of a hybrid's variability framed by culture. For LA Confidential, literacy works differently. Here, the name itself has long been used as evidence that indica means sedation. Bud tenders for years have leaned on it as a textbook case. If you want the knockout, this is it. A literate approach does not deny its myrcene-heavy expressions, but it goes further. It notes that LA Confidential also carries caryopyllene's grounding spice and sometimes limonene's surprising brightness. It recognizes that the plant is not chemically static, and that while it often delivers on the archetype, it can just as easily surprise. A literate bud tender reframes LA Confidential not as the Indica, but as a cultivar that usually leans heavy but can show other sides. That honesty builds trust. It replaces false certainty with informed nuance. For consumers, literacy means learning to move past the shorthand. Instead of asking, is this sativa or indica, literacy asks, what's in its terpene profile? What are the dominant compounds? And how does it express across different grows? Literacy accepts that strawberry cough is usually sweet and bright, but not always purely energetic. Literacy accepts that LA Confidential is usually heavy, but not always guaranteed to sedate. Literacy acknowledges the myth without being trapped by it. More importantly, literacy protects culture from disappointment. When a consumer buys strawberry cough, expecting pure energy and finds themselves slowed down by a heavier cut, they can feel misled if they believe the label is a promise. When they buy LA Confidential expecting to be knocked out and instead feel uplifted from limonene, they can feel confused. Those moments erode trust in the product and in the industry. But if the consumer has been guided into literacy, if they've been told that chemistry is layered, that names are not guarantees, that their own body and setting matter, then those experiences are not failures. They are part of the plant's range. Literacy turns contradiction into understanding instead of disappointment. This is why strawberry cough and LA Confidential matter so much for the literacy conversation. They are not just strains with stories. They are examples of how culture creates categories that chemistry does not always support. They are reminders that names can be misleading if taken as absolutes. And they are teaching tools for a more honest cannabis culture, one where consumers and budtenders alike can look past myth and read the plant with clarity. Literacy is not about stripping away the stories. Those stories are part of cannabis culture. It is about setting them alongside the chemistry so that consumers can see both and choose wisely. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential show us why this matters. Their names are strong enough to carry myths, but their chemistry is variable enough to demand literacy. The myth of Indica and Sativa did not survive simply because people believed it once. It survived because it was repeated, codified, and embodied by plants that seemed to prove the story. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential are two of those plants. Each became a cultural stand-in for one side of the binary. Each carried as evidence that the categories were real, even as their chemistry betrayed the labels. To understand how the myth worked, we have to look at how these cultivars were used as props in a larger narrative. In magazines, in strain reviews, in dispensary menus, in consumer conversations. Strawberry Cough was an easy candidate for the sativa myth. Its strawberry nose was bright, its terpenoline-dominant profile unusual, and its cultural aura framed it as daytime weed. That was all consumers and budtenders needed to slot it neatly into the sativa column. Strain reviews described it in almost identical language: uplifting, social, creative, a perfect smoke for the daytime. The variability in its chemistry rarely made it into those descriptions. Cuts that leaned heavier, phenotypes that carried more myrcene, or contexts where consumers felt slowed down, those contradictions were smoothed over or ignored. Instead, reviewers cherry-picked the experiences that confirmed the myth and amplified them. In forums, early leafly entries, and dispensary menus, Strawberry Cough was repeated as evidence that sativas were real and could be reliably identified. Every time a consumer read that description, expectation primed them to experience what the myth told them to expect. LA Confidential played the same role for Indica. Its dense buds, musky aroma, and myrcene-heavy chemistry gave reviewers and budtenders a ready-made story. Here was the knockout strain, the textbook Indica. It appeared in High Times as proof of sedation. It won cannabis cups that validated its identity. And it showed up in seed catalogs with descriptions that emphasized heaviness and body relaxation. In early dispensaries, Louisiana Confidential was a menu staple, listed under Indica with confident claims about couch lock. Consumers smoked it, expected heaviness, and often experienced it, not because myrcene guarantees sedation in a vacuum, but because the combination of chemistry and expectation made the outcome feel consistent. When limonene or pinene leaned stronger and the effect surprised, those stories were written off as anomalies rather than evidence against the category. LA Confidential was allowed to stand as proof of indica, and the myth grew stronger. The endurance of the myth came not from the plants themselves, but from how culture handled contradiction. In both Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential, variability existed. Not every cut of Strawberry Cough felt bright. Not every cut of LA Confidential knocked consumers down. But contradictions were not treated as evidence against the system. They were treated as quirks, as exceptions to the rule, as the funny stories you told about that one time the plant didn't behave the way it should have. The myth survived because culture insisted on smoothing rough edges instead of questioning the categories. What cemented the myth further was the rise of digital strain review culture. Sites like Leafly, Weedmaps, and countless forums repeated the binary with authority. Strains were sorted into columns, their effects reduced to bullet point traits. Strawberry Cough was uplifted, happy, energetic. LA Confidential was relaxed, sleepy, euphoric. These descriptors were easy to digest, easy to remember, and easy to spread. They turned complex chemistry into consumer slogans. And because people are wired to trust repeated information, the repetition itself made the myth feel factual. Strawberry Cough became the smiling daytime weed, and Confidential became the nighttime knockout. Together, they served as a binary pair, reinforcing the idea that cannabis could and should be divided cleanly into two worlds. But the truth, revealed by modern lab testing, genetic analysis, and experience across thousands of grows, is that the categories were never real. Strawberry Cough can be bright, yes, but it can also lean heavy. LA Confidential can be grounding, yes, but it can also surprise with unexpected uplift. Chemistry does not speak in binaries. It speaks in balances, in terpenes layered over cannabinoids, in expressions that shift with environment and phenotype. The myth of Indica and Sativa ignored that reality because it was easier to tell a simple story than to teach literacy. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential show us how that happened. They became mascots for categories that were never scientific, held up as examples in magazines, menus, and reviews that pretended to offer certainty. They show us how culture can take plants and flatten them into symbols, ignoring complexity in favor of simple opposites. And they show us why literacy is necessary, because without it, myths like these survive unchallenged, confusing consumers and eroding trust in the plant itself. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential will always be more than just plants in jars. They are cultural artifacts, symbols of how an entire generation learned to understand cannabis. One carried the legend of sweetness, of laughter, of daytime energy. The other carried the reputation of depth, sedation, and night. They became opposites in the collective imagination, stand-ins for categories that felt neat and reliable. But what we've seen across this arc is that those categories were myths. They simplified chemistry into slogans. They turned variability into certainty. And while those stories carried cannabis through prohibition and into the dispensary era, they also left consumers with tools too blunt to actually navigate the plant. Literacy is what steps in where myth breaks down. It is the act of reading Strawberry Cough not only as the sweet and bright cultivar people remember, but as a spectrum that can shift depending on its chemistry. It is the act of reading LA Confidential not only as a knockout indica, but as a plant with layers, capable of surprising uplift as well as grounding weight. Literacy means refusing to treat exceptions as mistakes. It means seeing complexity as truth, rather than as a problem to be smoothed over. For budtenders, literacy builds trust. Instead of promising consumers that Strawberry Cough will always be energetic or that LA Confidential will always be sedating, literacy offers honesty. These plants often lean that way, but they also carry other expressions. That transparency does not weaken trust. It strengthens it, because consumers learn that the industry is willing to tell them the truth, even when it's complicated. For consumers, literacy reshapes how cannabis is experienced. Instead of disappointment when the plant surprises them, they see those moments as part of the spectrum. Variability becomes understanding, not failure. But the real shift comes when we see literacy not just as a personal skill, but as a cultural change. Moving beyond Indica and Sativa is not about stripping away stories. It is about reshaping how the industry itself communicates. It is about building a future where cannabis is described in terms of chemistry, history, and experience rather than slogans. It is about creating an environment where regulators, cultivators, retailers, and consumers all speak the same language, a language that respects the plant's complexity. In that future, literacy is not just an individual advantage. It is the foundation of a transparent industry that earns trust instead of trading on myths. Strawberry Cough and LA Confidential show us why this matters. They became icons because they seemed to prove a binary. Now, they serve as reminders of why that binary must give way to spectrum, nuance, and honesty. That is the forward path for cannabis culture. Not sativa, not indica, literacy. If you value this work, if you believe cannabis deserves to be understood in its full depth, help us keep pushing forward. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who still lean on the old labels. Every share and every conversation builds momentum toward literacy. Together, we can move beyond the categories that once confined cannabis and build a culture that finally treats the plant as it really is. This video is intended solely for educational and historical purposes. It does not provide medical advice, make health claims, or encourage unlawful activity. Viewers should always follow the laws and regulations of their jurisdiction regarding cannabis use, possession, and cultivation.